Welcome to my weekly sermon series. This is number 12 of our series, The Names and Character of God. Now, you might hear some noises today. I just recently opened up the windows and the doors, and we live in an apartment complex, and right outside the door is the parking lot. And it's gravel, so you might hear some people pulling in or leaving along the way today. But give that no never mind, because we're going to focus on the message for the day. And today we're going to talk about, instead of talking about a particular name of God, we're going to speak of, just a second here. There we go. We're going to speak of of the fact that God tests us, and to see how we come out in the testing. My text is going to be from Genesis chapter 26, the first 5 verses. And we're going to talk a little bit about Isaac. And I'll be reading from the Christian Standard Bible, and it reads like this. There was another famine in the land, in addition to the one that had occurred in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, at Gerar. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land that I tell you about. Stay in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and bless you. For I will give all these lands to you and your offspring, and I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because Abraham listened to me and kept my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions." So obviously there was a famine. Another famine had occurred in the land, and he was looking at going down into Egypt. And I remember Egypt was a place of bondage for Israel, and so they wanted God is wanting them to stay away from there. He said, "You go to a place that I tell you, and I will take care of you." So with just a little bit of background, we know that Isaac is not mentioned all that often in Scripture. And most of the time when he is mentioned, it's in conjunction with someone else. For example, you will see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob mentioned on numerous occasions throughout the Old Testament in particular. And where he does appear in Scripture on his own, he comes through very well. Comes across very well. There are only 2 occasions where God spoke to him in a direct manner, and the text of which we read is one of these places, one of these 2 places. And this instance revealed a time of testing. There was another famine in the land. Whenever there's a famine in the land, you know it's a time of testing. It's a tough time. It's a rough time for people to get through. This shows us some very valuable things about how God works in times of testing. And a lot of times we don't think that God's at work when we're going through trials. We don't think that God's working when we're going through testings, but God is in fact at work, and he often works behind the scenes. So first of all, we're going to see how God usually shows himself somewhere in the time of testing. Almost every time. And he shows himself to be there. He lets us know that he is there. He comes and speaks to Isaac here in our text. He spoke to Isaac very directly. And he usually comes to us as well, but we often miss it. We often miss God's approach to us, God speaking to us, because we're so busy fussing and whining and groaning about the testing that we're going through, the trials we're facing, and the difficult time that we are encountering. So instead of whining and groaning and moaning, we need to just be listening for the voice of God. And sometimes in order to hear that voice, we must be quiet. Be still, be quiet, and know that I am God, the Scripture tells us. Next, we see that God's promises are not diminished by the problems we encounter while being tested. Let me say that again. God's promises are not diminished by the problems we encounter while being tested. Now the Bible is full of promises. It's full of promises to believers, things that we can lay claim to. We sing that old hymn, standing on the promises of God. And folks, we need to be standing on those promises day by day by day by day. And especially as we see the coming of Jesus, the times are pointing to the coming of Jesus as getting even closer. And certainly we're one day closer today than what we were yesterday. Isaac had been promised the land. The famine in the land raised questions in his mind about this promise. Do I even want this land? Do I want my ancestors to have this land because of the famine? Is God trying to tell me to do something else or go somewhere else? But God came to him with some assurances. Any promise we have is not altered by the problems that may come before the promise is fulfilled. I do want to read that again. Any promise we have is not altered by the problems that by the problems that may come before the promise is fulfilled. When God gives a promise, when God gives his word, sometimes we see in the Bible it is years, decades sometimes before the promises come to pass. So God's a God of his word. We can take that to the bank, so to speak. And we can trust God. We can believe in God that he will do what he said he would do. Next, we see that God suits his testing to the character and strength of his children. God knows us very intimately. He knows what we can handle. He knows how we respond to the various types of trials, to the various types of testing. And note the different directions. God left Abraham to determine himself. Abraham God had faith and God believed in Abraham, so Abraham determined himself what he would do. God told Isaac not to go down, and he later told Jacob to go in Genesis 46. So see, there was three different people there, and God dealt with them in three different ways. Now, assuming, as we said earlier, that Egypt is a place of trial and testing for his people, we see how God tailor makes tests to the people's character. And I think that's important. God knows our character. He knows what we're made of. He knows what we're able to see, what we're able to go through, what we're able to successfully overcome. Abraham, for example, was a man of high attainment and in close communication with God. You might remember that God said, take your son, the promised son, Isaac, whom we're talking about here, and go offering him for a sacrifice on Mount Moriah. And so and Abraham was reluctant, but although he didn't show any reluctance in the Bible, because he said God would supply. And sure enough, God would supply. God did supply. But Abraham had to be obedient and willing, if God didn't supply, to sacrifice his promised son, the son through whom the promises of God would be fulfilled. So all places were alike for him. Isaac, he was a good man, but he was not cut out for hardship. It just wasn't in his upbringing. It wasn't in his nature to be cut out for hardship. Jacob was a strong man, and he was accustomed to difficult times and hardships. So again, these three, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were all different, and God used them all in different ways. He takes our needs into account. When we're going through something, God takes our needs into account. He also considers character. He considers our abilities and what we're made of, so to speak, so that we can endure. We can and come out on the other end of the trial victorious. because that's what God ultimately wants us to be, is victorious. This is why we can say we're not tempted beyond our ability to handle it. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to bear it. See, when you're facing something, God provides a way out. God's not leaving you out there to dangle. He's not leaving you out there to blow in the wind, as it were, but he's leaving you out there for a purpose, to grow. It's a growing time. It's a time to increase your faith. It's a time to learn to lean and rely upon God in a greater way and in a greater dimension. God's presence in testing enables us not only to go, but also to stay anywhere that he leads us, anywhere that he wants us to go. We know we can go anywhere with Jesus. Anywhere with Jesus, I can safely go, the old song says. It's equally true we can stay anywhere he wants us to go. We might think, oh my goodness, there's no way I could do that. But if God is calling you, he's qualifying you, he's equipping you, and he'll be with you to do what he's called you to do. The song says, if Jesus goes with me, I'll go anywhere. And that is a great song, a great message, and a powerful message in that song. When God is testing us, we need to stay in some of the difficult places for his will to be perfected or completed in our lives. Now, we don't like going through testings, folks. There's not a one of us that I believe said, all right, I get to go through a trial. I get to go through a testing. How excited I am for that. No, we want to learn the lesson. We want to have the growth that we need to have. We want to increase our faith. We want to learn to trust God in a greater dimension and in a greater way. And then we want to get out of that trial. We want to get out of that valley. We want to get on through and past that learning experience and that growth experience with God. But sometimes we got to stay there a little longer than what we would prefer to stay. The resistance we face will develop character as well as that stick-to-itiveness, as I like to call it, to accomplish great things for God. There are so many things that we can accomplish for God, so many things we need to accomplish for God, so many things that he has asked us to accomplish, and will continue to rely upon us. Remember, we're his hands extended. We're his feet who walk. We're reaching out to the oppressed, and to say, let him touch Jesus. Let Jesus touch others through us. Next, God's promises are provided for our stay in times of testing. Standing on the promises. Stand on those promises of God. The deeper the trial, the greater the need to remind ourselves of the promise. Go back to the Word when you're going through something. Look up some of these promises and say, that promise, that's for me. That's for believers. That's for me. And I'm claiming that. I'm standing on the promises of God. Those that must live by faith have need often to review and repeat to themselves the promises, just like I said, the promises that they are to live upon, especially when they are called to any insistence of suffering. You know what? There's going to be times of suffering in the Christian life. Just because you're a believer, just because you're a Christian, doesn't mean you will never have trial times or a time of trying or a difficult time in your life, because you will. That's just part of life. It's part, Jesus had tough times. The disciples and who later became apostles, they had difficult times. They suffered. And so we too can expect to suffer for the cause of Jesus Christ. Now, God's promises are secured through our obedience. If we're obedient to God. And we can lay hold of those promises. We can lay claim to those promises. Notice all the terms used of Abraham in verse 5. Go back and look at that. They indicate the full extent of his faith. He believed God enough to act on his commandments and accept his promises. How about you? Do you believe God is a God of his word? Do you believe in the promises of God? Does your faith show you, looking back at how God has taken care of you and how he has come through for you? Is your faith strong enough and activated so you can look back and say, yeah, he did it before, he'll do it again. All I've got to do is believe and lay hold onto the promises, lay claim to the promises of God. God often has one of two related purposes in our testing. Number one, to try our faith, to see what our faith's really made of. And number two, to determine our level of obedience to him. He wants to see what our faith is made of, to try our faith and see how obedient we will be to him. So I think that's important for us to acknowledge and to realize. We can be sure of receiving the promises when we determine in our hearts we're going to obey. Now, as we wrap this particular message up today, Isaac found how God works in times of testing. My question to you is, will you accept God's operation through your times of trial, through your times of testing? Will you accept God's work in your life during those times? Will you continue to obey him and serve him while going through these tough times? Let's not be fair weather Christians. Let's just lay claim to the promises of God. Let's allow God to grow our faith through the testing times, through the difficult times, and through the tough times. All right, God bless you. Thank you for joining today. I pray this has been a blessing to you. Please do share this message with someone who might be encouraged in their journey with Jesus. So until next time, next Wednesday, we'll be back with another message. So I pray that you'll have a wonderful week, and remember to enjoy the journey.